The winds of change howled through the halls of Winterfell as Eddard Stark stood at the center of his family's ancestral home. It was a time of upheaval and uncertainty. The rebellion that had brought Robert Baratheon to the throne had been a bitter and bloody one. But in this alternate reality, the winds of fate blew differently. Robert Baratheon never sat on the Iron Throne Eddard Stark did. The decision, while born of necessity, had enormous implications. Robert Baratheon's rebellion had been fueled by his desire to overthrow the Mad King, Aerys II Targaryen, and claim the throne for himself. But what if Ned Stark, the honorable Lord of the North, had taken up the mantle instead? What if, in the aftermath of Robert's rebellion, it had been Ned, with his unwavering sense of justice, who had been crowned King of Westeros? Had Ned Stark become king, Westeros would have looked vastly different from the chaotic realm that followed Robert's reign. Ned Stark's vision for the Seven Kingdoms was rooted in honor, duty, and a deep understanding of the weight of responsibility. Unlike Robert, whose reign was marked by indulgence, excess, and a lack of true leadership, Ned Stark's rule would have been one of restraint, fairness, and stability. He was a man who had lived through the horrors of war and had a deep sense of what it meant to govern. Ned, unlike Robert, would have been deeply committed to justice. His first major decision as king would have been to maintain the peace across Westeros. Unlike Robert's violent ascension to power, Ned would have sought to unite the Seven Kingdoms through diplomacy, fostering alliances with the noble houses instead of demanding their submission by force. The Targaryens, though exiled, would have been treated with a degree of respect rather than being hunted down as they were under Robert's rule. Ned would have seen them as a potential source of strength, not a threat to his throne. His rule would have also been characterized by a deep commitment to the welfare of the common folk. Robert Baratheon, though beloved by some for his victories in the war, had shown little interest in the welfare of the people he ruled. His court was filled with intrigue and decadence, and the realm suffered as a result. Ned Stark, however, would have implemented policies that promoted the welfare of all his subjects, not just the noble families. His strong sense of honor would have led him to seek justice for all, not just the powerful. The North, under Ned's leadership, would have been treated with greater respect than it was under Robert. Robb Stark, Ned's son, would have been raised in a kingdom where the North's autonomy was respected and valued. The realm would have been united under Ned's rule, not by force, but by trust in his leadership. The borders of Westeros would have been secure, and the constant infighting between the noble houses would have been quelled by Ned's steadfast presence on the throne. Yet, the challenges Ned would face as king would be no small matter. The Lannisters, still a powerful family, would have sought to challenge Ned's rule. Cersei, now queen by virtue of her marriage to Robert, would have fought to retain her power, especially in the face of the loss of her beloved Joffrey. While Robert had been too indulgent to care about his wife's schemes, Ned, ever the vigilant ruler, would have noticed the subtle political maneuvers of Cersei and her family. Cersei's power plays to secure her children's future would have been countered by Ned's keen sense of justice, though it would put him at odds with his court. Tywin Lannister, Cersei's father and head of House Lannister, would not have taken kindly to Ned's rise to power. Tywin was a man who understood the Game of Thrones better than most, and he would have seen Ned as a man of honor but naive in the ways of true politics. Tywin would have sought to manipulate the situation, using his family's wealth and influence to undermine Ned's rule. While Tywin had little love for Robert Baratheon, he would have respected the strength that Robert's leadership commanded. With Robert out of the picture, Tywin would see the Lannisters' opportunity to take the throne for themselves, though Ned's strength would make this path more difficult. The Stark-Lannister dynamic would have been an interesting one. Tyrion Lannister, ever the tactician, would have recognized Ned's nobility and would likely have sought a political alliance. Unlike the scheming Cersei, Tyrion would have seen the benefit of aligning with the Stark family. However, the tension between Ned and the Lannisters would have been ever present, especially as Cersei's ambitions for her children continued to clash with Ned's commitment to justice. Meanwhile, in the north, the rise of the Targaryen threat would have still loomed. Daenerys Targaryen, the last living member of House Targaryen, would have continued her journey to reclaim the throne. Her dragons, though still young and untested, would have been a formidable force in the long run. But with Ned on the throne, Daenerys' conquest of Westeros would not have been as simple as it was in the original timeline. Her dragons would have been feared, yes, but Ned's leadership would have led to a far more unified Westeros, a realm that might have been prepared for her return. Instead of the political turmoil and disarray that Robert's death had caused, Ned's leadership would have forced Daenerys to consider diplomacy before launching an invasion. The Stark legacy? Had Ned Stark taken the throne, the legacy of House Stark would have been far stronger. Robb Stark, Jon Snow, and Sansa Stark would have played pivotal roles in united Westeros. With their father as king, they would have been better positioned to shape the future of the Seven Kingdoms. Robb, as the rightful heir, would have been groomed to take his place beside his father as the future of the Baratheon-Stark alliance. Jon Snow, though still the bastard of the Stark family, would have gained greater respect and stature in this alternate timeline, possibly as Ned's closest advisor or even the commander of the Kingsguard. The realm would have been united under the banner of House Stark, with the North holding a special place in the kingdom. Jon's role would have been pivotal as the North continued to preserve its independence while remaining loyal to the Iron Throne. The tension between the South and the North would have been far less pronounced, as Ned's leadership would have bridged the divide between the two regions, setting the stage for a more unified kingdom. In this alternate reality, Ned Stark's rise to power would have allowed for a more stable and just Westeros. The tensions that led to the War of the Five Kings would have been avoided, and the politics of the realm would have been shaped by Ned's honor, diplomacy, and commitment to justice. The Lannisters, the Tyrells, and even the Targaryens would have had to reckon with the might of House Stark on the throne. With Eddard Stark on the throne, Westeros would have seen a radically different political landscape, one defined by his sense of honor, justice, and personal integrity. His leadership style was far removed from Robert Baratheon's indulgence and impulsive rule. As king, Ned would have relied heavily on his core values of duty, family, and fairness. But these same qualities would also expose him to new dangers and challenges. The Lannisters, a bitter rivalry. The survival of Robert Baratheon's reign had caused a deep fissure between the Lannisters and the crown. Even without the deaths that followed Robert's passing, the Lannisters' ambitions had always been clear, especially Tywin Lannister's desire to control the throne. With Robert dead, Cersei and her children were thrown into a volatile situation. Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella would have been forced to accept their lesser status in the Baratheon line. Ned Stark, by contrast, would have united the realm under his authority, but in doing so, he would have faced a continual struggle against the Lannisters' ambition. Without Robert's negligence, Cersei would have found her influence in the court weakened. Though Robert never fully exercised control over his court, his presence had kept the Lannisters at bay. In contrast, Ned's keen sense of justice would not have tolerated Cersei's growing power. She would have been far more closely watched, and her political machinations would have been constrained by Ned's vigilance. Tywin Lannister, the mastermind of House Lannister, would have been more calculated in his attempts to weaken Ned's position. Tywin's resentment for the Starks, as well as his desire to increase his family's influence, would have made him a key figure in plotting against Ned's reign. Yet, Tywin's respect for strength would have likely compelled him to approach Ned with more diplomacy than he did Robert, seeing the honor and leadership that Ned brought to the throne. However, This also meant that Tywin's actions would have been more indirect. Instead of openly challenging Ned, Tywin would have used his considerable wealth and political influence to foster rivalries among the other noble houses, leading to long-term instability. His tactics would have revolved around influencing Ned's allies rather than confronting him outright. This would have kept the political environment in Westeros tense but controlled. The Tyrells and the Reach. House Tyrell's role would have shifted dramatically under Ned's reign. Margaery Tyrell would have likely been married to a Baratheon heir, but with Robert still on the throne, her marriage to Joffrey would never have occurred. The Tyrells, though ambitious, would have had to play a more strategic role under Ned. The political power of the Tyrells in King's Landing would not have been as pronounced, and their ambitions to marry their children into the royal family would have taken longer to come to fruition. The Reach was already one of the wealthiest and most powerful regions of Westeros, and House Tyrell knew that aligning themselves with the crown was vital. However, Ned's fair leadership would have led the Tyrells to engage in more subtle political maneuvering rather than the outright power plays they engaged in after Robert's death. Mace Tyrell, the head of House Tyrell, would have had to build a more cautious relationship with Ned Stark, rather than outright defying the crown as the Tyrells did in the aftermath of Robert's death. Instead of a war for the Iron Throne, the Tyrells may have served as more discreet, loyal allies, working with Ned to maintain the peace in Westeros. Their role would not have been the same power brokers that they became in the struggle for power following Robert's death. However, the Tyrells' influence would still have been significant. Margaery would have been a player in the court, and her political marriages would have positioned her family for greater future influence. Robb Stark and the North. Robb Stark's role as king in the North would have remained a critical factor in the political situation. With Ned on the throne, Robb's declaration as king would have never occurred, at least not in the same way. Robb's loyalty to his father and his honor would have led him to fight beside Ned in battles against the Lannisters, but it's possible that Robb would not have been in the same position to claim the North for himself. Instead, Robb might have been a leading general for his father, assisting in military matters in the Riverlands and other territories. This alliance with Ned would have prevented Robb from declaring himself king in the North. Instead, the North would have maintained its loyalty to the Baratheon crown, securing its place in the realm. However, the Stark bloodline would have continued to run strong in the North, with Robb inheriting the legacy of his father's honorable rule. Jon Snow, still a Stark in heart if not in name, would also have found a different role. As the North remained loyal to the Baratheons, Jon's role as the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch would have remained crucial. Jon's commitment to his oath might have been tested, but his loyalty to his family and the Stark name would have kept him from breaking his vows. Still, Jon's future would have been tied to the North and its leaders, most likely Robb, while his role in the fight against the growing threat from beyond the Wall would have continued. The alliance with House Stark would have strengthened the overall position of the Baratheon monarchy, ensuring that the North remained loyal while still keeping its independence. The Stark-Lannister rivalry, which had been brewing ever since Ned's imprisonment in King's Landing, would have simmered down under Robert's reign, with Tywin Lannister respecting Robert's strength. However, Tywin's ambitions would have persisted, and the eventual clash between the Lannisters and the Baratheons would have been inevitable. The Targaryen threat. With Robert alive, the return of Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons would have faced even more resistance. Robert's rule would have kept the Targaryens' threat at bay, likely leading to Daenerys' continued exile. With no power vacuum to exploit, Daenerys' conquest of Westeros would have been delayed. Her dragons would still have been a formidable weapon, but Robert's Baratheon rule would have been a significant obstacle in her path. The realm would have been more stable, making it difficult for Daenerys to gain a foothold. However, Her eventual return could not be avoided, but it would have been a far more challenging endeavor for her. With the political power of House Tyrell, House Lannister, and the Stark family solidified under Robert's reign, Daenerys would have needed far stronger alliances to pursue her claim to the throne. By the time Daenerys would have sought her conquest, Robert's heirs and their powerful allies would have had significant defenses in place.